Okay, we're going to get started now. This meeting is recorded. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a real joy to welcome you to this gathering and to celebrate the launch of our special issue on democratic pedagogies published in the Journal of Curriculum and Pedagogy. My name is Paul Emilianovich, and on behalf of the co-editing team, alongside Melissa, Jesse, Julian, Chenjerima, and Bettina, we welcome you. Now, this project was supported by Participedia. Participedia is the largest database and one of the largest communities researching and mobilizing knowledge on democratic innovations. And it is a project that is the start of an ongoing journey, shaped by many voices, traditions, and hard questions. So today is not only a moment of recognition, but it's a moment of invitation to be in community. It is a chance to speak honestly about what it means to teach, learn, and to practice democracy when so much around us tells us that actually democracy should stay out of the classroom, that we need to be more market-oriented, selectively apolitical, and more relevant. And sometimes, of course, our pedagogies can lead to the threat of arrest, job dismissal, beatings, immigration removal, or even death. But before we begin, we want to offer a moment of grounding. Although a digital database and global community, Participedia is grounded at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, what is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga nations. This land is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The agreement describes the dish to represent the territory and one spoon to symbolize the peoples living on and sharing the resources of the land, only taking what we need and keeping the dish clean. We recognize the ongoing effects of colonial processes of erasure, marginalization, and extraction, and we encourage those joining us today to reflect solidaristically on the Indigenous sovereignties, colonial legacies, and life relations on the land in which you are residing or find yourself on in this moment. Now, to why we're here. Democratic pedagogies begin with a simple but radical premise. Education is not the transmission of facts about the cultivation, but rather the cultivation of people who can participate meaningfully in collective self-governance. At their best, democratic pedagogies create the conditions for empathy, agential relating, collaboration, and imagination. They push us to confront power, to practice disagreement, to take responsibility for the entanglements that we are a part of. They challenge us to see knowledge as something made together rather than delivered from above or a commodity bought and sold. And they insist that learning is always relational, always situated, always shaped by struggle and possibility. Now, one of the strengths of this emergent field, as everyone in this room knows, is the extraordinary diversity. I mean, we draw in this issue from indigenous teachings, popular education, critical traditions, feminist practices, community organizing, design and experimental methods, and many other lineages, all bringing us together around this shared idea, democratic pedagogies. And it's an idea in which we disagree vigorously and generatively. But these disagreements are not a problem to be solved, to be rectified. There's no holistic solution. They are the energy that keeps this work alive, right? This in pursuit of the seemingly out of reach, the beleaguered flame. They remind us that democracy is not a settled form, but a living practice with pedagogies of creative survival, of self-governance. It's a very dynamic and emergent space. And as we know, across this diversity, we share a sense that something is deeply wrong. Many of us feel that the bond between education and democracy has been severed, or as it was recently described to me, as the great betrayal. It's a narrative that holds true, I think, for many. Our institutions are increasingly shaped by metrics, competition, and technologies that narrow rather than expand our capacity to think and act together to confront the many so-called wicked problems that are facing us. Students feel disoriented and distrustful. Educators feel constrained and exhausted. Some of our contributors today have to leave the room early just for many of their other responsibilities. Communities feel excluded from the very systems that claim to serve them, and thus have even developed their own classroom spaces. If the next generation of democratic outcomes are going to respond to this moment, then education cannot remain a spectator. It has to be a site of collective self-governance, of co-design, of co-creating the pedagogies that will inspire sustainable and equitable solutions to the wicked problems that we face. So this gathering is really, it's not only celebratory, it's really an opening for us to speak with honesty about our frustrations, our failures, our tensions, and our strategies for navigating them. It is a space to share practices that work and to name the ones that do not work or the ones that hinder our work. It is a chance to recognize the emotional, creative, and political labor of this work, and to remember really that none of us are alone in doing this. And so my hope and our hope as co-editors and this kind of community of contributors is that today strengthens our sense of emerging community moving forward around this idea of democratic pedagogies. This is really the beginning. And I want to share one more piece of exciting news before I pass it off. In the new year, probably around late January, early February, we'll be issuing a call for papers, a public call for an edited volume to continue this conversation on democratic pedagogies. We welcome proposals from all of you and from the communities that you represent and are networked in collaboration with. And thank you for being here and for being in conversation with us. I won't speak any further. I'll now pass it off to you, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Hi, everyone. It's just really lovely to be here on a frigid day in Toronto, to be in this warmer environment of thinking about democratic pedagogies. In relation to that, I would like to ask you as participants to give us some insights or to share some insights into why you're here today, what brought you here. What are your interests in respect of democratic pedagogies? And if you can share that with us in the chat, we can read a few. We can read a few out for everybody, just to get a sense of who we all are and why we're here today. While you are busy writing up in the chat, I'll proceed also with talking a little bit about, Paul's introduced the topic really well, but just to say that what brought us to this journal and to thinking through this question of democratic pedagogies was our concern as a collective who had been involved in, Participedia's work, thinking about democracy and particularly also thinking about teaching and learning in respect of democracy. We were all concerned with the kind of current conjuncture in respect of the hollowing out of democracy and democratic practice and the ways in which our institutions have very easily capitulated to this kind of rising authoritarianism. But what we also understood, though, is that, one of the reasons that this capitulation has been so swift and so easy is because it's been a long time coming. Political democracy or liberal democracy as it exists in our societies today is often buttressed by the most authoritarian or at least deeply hierarchical institutional practices. So, if we look at the household, the way in which children are treated, if we look at schools and the hierarchy at schools, if we look at the universities and the places where we work, and the extent to which power is so unevenly distributed. So we wanted to apply our minds to how to intervene, and especially to intervene where we're located. So some of us obviously takes very seriously ideas from many academics and intellectuals on intervention, and that education is not neutral, that we need to intervene where we are, that we don't just think about the world, that we want to intervene to change it. So what we understand is that, democracy and democratic practice doesn't just exist, it's a practice. It must be built. And so in the context of those inherent inequalities in the university, outside of the university, in classrooms, the kind of uneven power dynamics. How do we build classrooms? How do we build pedagogies, practices that create the conditions for democracy? And understanding, as Paul has just mentioned, is that not only is this journal an opening for this kind of conversation, but also that we understand democracy as always an opening as opposed to an attained goal. Like the minute you attain democracy, it no longer exists. So what are the ways in which we intervening in our locations, whether they're formal or informal, to create the conditions for democratic practice, as against the classism, the racism, the coloniality that persist in our institutions. So to go to the chat, thank you all so much for participating in this. We have participants who are interested in supporting students in building skills and competencies for change making, which is fantastic. We have people who are carrying out deliberative decision making on municipal policies in schools. This is also fantastic because I think we can have really substantial conversation in this workshop on those kinds of issues. Parents who are homeschooling, also another site of important interventions and struggle and hierarchies. And yes, I've just had a child who's just graduated from high school, so I'm with you on the deficiencies of public education in Ontario, and the inequalities of public education in Ontario. Place-based and sustainability education. This is just really wonderful. So we're going to collect all of these interventions in the chat, because some of these we want to talk about more obviously today, but also going forward we would love to engage with these kinds of ideas in more significant ways, again, as Paul has mentioned. So thank you all so much. You can keep those coming, and I'm going to pass on to my colleague Chandrima to introduce the speakers for today.
Hi, thanks, Melissa. So I am Chandrima. I'm one of the contributors, and now you will have the opportunity to listen to three of our amazing contributors who will speak for about 5 minutes each, summarizing for us the main points of their argument, as well as offering us some reflections on their contributions, and hopefully also sharing some thoughts in terms of the ongoing relevance of their work. And after the paper talks, the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions to the presenters, or if you have observations and comments of your own, please share them either on the chat, or, you can raise your hand and ask questions. So we have three presenters. We will start with Sarah, but Sarah will have to leave in a bit because she has a thesis defense to go to. So we are grateful that she could make time for us. So following her talk, we will take questions on Sarah's presentation so that you have the ability to have a direct conversation with her and respond to her with comments or questions. And then we will have the last two speakers doing their talks back to back, and then we will open up the floor for conversations. So Sarah, so just a brief introduction, Dr. Sarah Marie Wiebe is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria and an adjunct professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Okay, amazing. I'll just see if I can share my slides here. I've got a few images, but It doesn't look like it's working for me. So I may just not be able to use those today, which is totally fine. Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome and introduction. I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation and to be chatting with you all. And I'm calling in from the unceded Coast Salish, Lekwungen, and WSÁNEĆ territory, where the University of Victoria is based and also where I live. And I'm sharing with you some highlights from my paper. Grounded Governance, Cultivating Social Justice Through Community Engaged Learning with Pepakin Hout or Blossoming Place. And I'll put a link to the organization in the chat in a moment. So this article began from a course that I revised and taught on governance in the School of Public Administration to include ecological governance and Indigenous governance, as well as integrated community engaged learning. So this included mainly a site visit to a nonprofit WSÁNEĆ-led organization on the Saanich Peninsula, and it's located just outside of Butchart Gardens for context, as well as the Portland Cement factory, which has some legacy contamination issues. So it's a very fascinating ecological site. So the central argument of this paper is that by deepening student relationships to local ecological governance systems, they become better equipped to envision and enact the worlds they seek to create. And so back in the classroom, after having completed some of this land-based learning, including removing invasive species and learning about native plants, students formed 3 groups where they represented the nonprofit Pepakin Hout organization, the Butchart Family Foundation, and then the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. And they talked about issues related how to address the legacy of contamination in the region. And this overall approach does draw inspiration from scholars like Bell Hooks, who explains the value and significance of engaged learning. And this class was also a collaborative effort between the Studies in Social Justice program at the University of Victoria, as well as the School of Public Administration and the community partner involved. And the pedagogy aims to integrate community engaged learning more deeply into the study of public administration, which is not always the case. And so doing so in practice emphasizes relationship building with local Indigenous-led community organizations while supporting student learning objectives by teaching social justice through collaborative and meaningful public engagement. And this kind of place-based learning is critical for students of public administration as they deepen their learning about governance to include ecological governance and Indigenous perspectives. And as also discussed in the paper, this approach is embodied, it's sensory, it involves an engagement of the senses. And so there's some discussion of different senses, including, taste, sharing food, listening deeply, the smells, and touch and pulling invasive plants, connecting with one another in a circle. So all of that kind of experiential sensory knowledge is discussed in the paper as well. And so this writing was so much fun to reflect on in terms of pedagogy. So often we're focused on our research, and this was really such an enjoyable process of deeply reflecting on what it means to teach and to take students into a range of contexts, to think really deeply about democracy and public administration. And it's inspired by other Indigenous political ecologists. So I have a couple of books beside me. So one I'm sure many are familiar with, Braiding Sweetgrass, who talks a lot about a democracy of species. And so her work is referred to in this chapter. She talks about more than human care and relationality and conversation with others. And the other one that I want to highlight is Dr. Jennifer Grenz, who's written this amazing book called Medicine Wheel for the Planet and has a lot actually to say that made me think deeply about teaching policy to students. So Robin Wall-Kimmerer expands further on the concept of democracy of species to explain how this includes a kind of citizenship premised on shared beliefs and upholding laws like natural laws, including the law of reciprocity, regeneration, and mutual flourishing. And so finally, to wrap up here, what does this contribution mean to our discipline? I think really well aligned with the opening remarks and the opening to the special issue, as Paul's explained, this approach is really about challenging colonial extractive governance relationships and instead centering care, stories, emergence, abundance. And it also challenges problematic terms. In public administration, we often see terms like resource management and stakeholder relations or consultation, and these can be very problematic terms. And as Jennifer Grenz highlights, there's a danger apparent in shape-shifting forms of colonialism, which can take shape in all kinds of governance and institutional arrangements and transactional relations. And they're often enacted through policy decisions that take place far away from affected sites and communities and can manifest in extractive relations through box-ticking consultation, for example. And further, troubling situations occur when desk-bound policymakers create regulations that make zero ecological sense. And there I'm quoting directly from Jennifer Grenz. And so I certainly want students that I mentor to try and avoid those pitfalls. So, as an educator, I'm encouraging students to apply critical thinking and personal reflection about the ongoing legacy of colonialism, along with Indigenous self-determination. And this is why place-based experiential learning is so important to challenge calculated and extractive ways of learning and knowing. And so finally, this is important right now because there's eroding trust in public institutions, democracy, and governance. I hope that this work can contribute to a wider movement to enhance civic education. I noticed in the chat a lot of people interested in education at multiple levels, and I've elaborated my thoughts on this in a recent report to the Legislative Assembly provincially, their special committee on democratic and electoral reform. If anyone's interested, I can pop a link to that committee in the chat. But then just to conclude, I want to emphasize how democratic pedagogies can cultivate avenues for more participatory forms of governance rather than top-down hierarchical modes of command and control ways of relating to each other and more than human worlds. So thank you for being here, for listening. Hope to stay in touch, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. I think Sarah might be able to stay with us for the Q&A. So maybe we will just revise a little bit and go to Joanna. And we'll have all of the 3 paper talks and then followed by the conversation. So Joanna Ashworth is a research associate with Community Engaged Research Initiative at Simon Fraser University and Participedia Net.
Great. Hi. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think somebody has my slides that you were going to share for me, but I'll wait for a second, see if those can get uploaded. Anyway, I'll just start by saying thank you. I'm coming to you from the west coast of Canada on the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish peoples. And I'm very happy for the opportunity to have contributed to this special issue and looking at the work that we did, Pedagogies of Radical Democracy, Lessons from Summer School. Really, it was an opportunity to go back to all the notes, to the student assignments, student reflections, my own personal notes, interviews with students, to really reflect on the meaning of this summer school. And I also want to make a personal shout out to the team of us that worked on this project. Well, Paul, of course, you were front and center, Jesse Carson, Etienne Cardan Trudeau, and Tara Mahoney, my colleague from CIRI. So I'm based at Simon Fraser University, and this summer school was a wonderful collaboration between SFU, CIRI, and Participedia. And basically, it was a couple of summers ago where we brought together, we created a credit course. It was a 5-credit course in which we invited students, civil society leaders, community members to participate. Students came from all disciplines, not just political science, which was very refreshing. 31 participants. So the program explored radical democratic theory through lived experience from the literature, case studies, and students' own lives. We had a lot of dialogue, and we focused on collective inquiry as kind of our teaching method. And our aim was to deepen democratic practice by experimenting with shared power, creative disruption, and participatory learning. Maybe you could advance the slide a couple for me. Yeah, the next slide would be great. And just a little bit about how we're defining radical democracy. So we really looked at it as deepening democracy by expanding civic participation, acknowledging the role of conflict, and strengthening public deliberation. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but those were our sort of broad defining characteristics of looking at the roots of democracy, really. The program drew from critical theorists like Freire, Hooks, Latour, Mouffe, Taylor, and Escobar, and others. And we asked students to examine how power operates, how it might be shared, contested, or redesigned. And more broadly, we define democracy as a dynamic, evolving process, not a static set of institutions. So the next slide, please. So just a little bit about the paper. So we were asked to talk about our sort of 3 central points and how this work contributes to the field. So I'll just start by saying one of the main points that came out of this paper was this idea that radical democracy is learned through praxis. So we really emphasize that learning about radical democracy is not really about studying the literature, although we did labor very hard over what the body of reading should be, how much, how little. We co-created community guidelines with the students. In other words, they talked about what it is they wanted to, what were the norms for interacting with each other. They led all the seminars based on the readings that they did. They co-created, we had no grading. We had pass or fail for those who were taking the course for credit, but there was no grades. But we did a lot of feedback on assignments so that there was an opportunity for a deep conversation with individual students as well as in the collective. And we had embodied kinds of learning activities such as walking tours and engagement with community issues. We had many people from the community that came in to talk about their projects and initiatives. And we had an array of scholars that came in from right across Canada from our Participedia ecosystem, which was incredibly rich. And the student reflections, as I say, the papers that they wrote, the reflections on their own learning showed that these experiential and participatory methods produce a very deep understanding that we think, and our claim is that they are a deeper understanding than formal instruction alone. There is a video, I'm not sure if anyone has access to that, I can just pop it in the chat later, of the students' testimonials. The things that they took away were really quite remarkable. Another one of our outcomes was that creativity, imagination, and relationality are essential democratic capacities. So we really emphasize the importance, and we got at that through a lot of the case studies that we shared, in which creative methods were used to actually intervene in systems and create change. And we tried over and over again to show as many of those examples and the ways that imagination, imagining new futures, was really an act of radical democratic innovation, in that people could actually take part in trying to imagine these futures and then backcast into what are the steps that would get us to these kind of futures. I think the school treated imagination as a political resource. And I think that is something that time and time again from the testimonials we heard from students was quite a new and revelatory kind of outcome of their experience. So so imagination, relationality, and creativity were major outcomes. And then there's the next slide, please. And the third finding was that diverse lived experiences of the students themselves and the tensions that those created were a source of democratic learning. So we really tried to not shut down the differences in terms of what the students brought in their own perspectives on issues like colonization, marginalization, capitalism, climate inaction, and to see new pathways for agency and collective action through this diversity. There were sometimes a lot of tensions created, but because we had these norms of respect and support and listening, there was a lot of space for those tensions to be expressed, and also in some cases to be resolved. And the next slide, please. I just wanted to include this, that we did a lot of programming also with the community. So outside of the classroom and outside of our own sort of work as a summer school, we invited some of the scholars that are part of the Participating Network, Jonathan Rose, Kathy Walker, Bonnie Abawa, Melissa Williams, and Genevieve Fuji Johnson to come and talk to a public audience about their ideas for greater democratic practices and implications for the classroom, for the public square, and for government. And Stuart Poyntz facilitated. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Stuart was not able to be here today, but Stuart and I had the pleasure of working together on this paper. So I just want to acknowledge that. The next point in terms of contributions to the field, I think as has already been said, there's a lot to be, I think, learned from specific cases and in specific classrooms. We just heard an incredible case study from Victoria. So democratic education, civic engagement, community engaged scholarship, these are all ways that I think these kinds of the summer school and other kinds of models where we're actively experimenting with democratic practices, I think do contribute to the body of literature in democratic education more broadly. I think thinking of the classroom as a laboratory really offers a kind of opportunity to experiment and to use democratic skills actively and intentionally, like deliberation, collective problem solving, power sharing, and imaginative action through the kinds of projects that we did. I think those are all worthy contributions to the field. And just in terms of personal and professional significance of this work, I think the paper reinforces the importance of creating learning spaces where participants can co-design the norms, how they want to interact together, how they engage in dialogue across difference, and to move from critique to creative intervention. So I think this kind of approach validates the pedagogical choices that we champion at CIRI, and I think at Participedia, that relational teaching, experiential inquiry, and the idea that democracy is strengthened when people practice it together and not merely study it. I think the findings signal where democratic innovation is heading, which I think we would agree what we need more of is inclusive, embodied, participatory, and creative modes of learning and civic action. So those are just some of the reflections, and thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to the conversation that follows. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Joanna. So we will move to our final speaker, who is Rachel Carvalho, who is a PhD candidate in the program Democracy in the 21st Century at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra, Portugal. Rachel.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Hi, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here today. I first learned about Participedia in 2019 through my supervisor, Giovanni Allegretti. Since then, I have been following the platform closely and recently joined the summer school in Rio de Janeiro, which was a very incredible experience for me. These publications connected directly with my dissertations and also with my professional work in Brazil before starting my PhD. My articles come from the pre-field phases of my research, and during this period, I analyzed documents from two community-based associations, in Brazil, Raízes, and Pelourinho in Cabo Verde. What I wanted to understand was, how does these associations produce political learning in everyday life? And how do their discourses and repertoire shape the democratic participatory and pedagogic democracies? A central element of my work is a non-formal education, learning that happens in the real life, in relationships, community practices, collective actions, and everyday problem solving. This type of learning transforms associations into schools of citizenship. I follow the ideas with Mark Warren, Ark Fung, Barquero, Legion Luckman. So we have a great theory behind this, a school of citizenship. People learn trust, cooperation, responsibility, and political agents by doing, not through formal instructions. A key insight from these documents is how strongly each association is shaped by a different political pedagogy repertoire. Raízes draws Paulo Freire. Dialogue, autonomy, problem posing, actions, reflections, actions. And Pelourinho draws on Almícar Cabral, a political conscience, cultural resistance, memory, and dignity. Freire and Cabral are not theoretical references only. They guide everyday practice and means of participation. From these documents, we can see a brief overview of what I consider the Pedagogies democráticas. In Raízes, in Brazil, we can see a community diagnostic, leadership and citizenship training, workshops, seminars, debates, participations in conscious and public hearing, environmental educations, cultural activities like cine clubs. Raízes teaching democracies through participations and institutional dialogue. It's very common in Brazil, the relations between a state and civil society. In Cabo Verde, Pelourinho, doing the Cabral March, is co-supporting courses, entrepreneurship courses, sports and cultural programs, community cleanups, food distributions, and anti-poverty initiatives, community gardens too. Political warnings for young and children. Pelourinho's teaches democracies through identity, memory, and collective care, art, and activism. Across both cases, the message is clear. Democracy is learning in everyday life, in conversations, cultural ritual, community projects, negotiations, and shared decisions and power. Each association teach democracy differently, but both strengthened agents, awareness, and participations. In the moment when many democracies are under pressures, these communities associations show us how democracy's capacities are building from below, from daily practices, from memory and imaginations, from hope for people engaged and financial resources. Or understand the time. They remind us that democratic pedagogies are not limited to institutional. They are alive in communities, in lived experience, and the repertoires that people use to interpret their reality. Therefore, the main message of my articles is simple. If you want to understand how democracy is strengthened, we need to observe the places where the people actually experienced it. And the global south in the territory shaped by absence of public policy, but we have a resistance, memories, inequalities, and also by imaginations and indignations. These associations, Raízes and Pelourinhos, are writing their honor democracy history everyday life. Thank you so much for your attention. And the most incredible outcomes in investigated these documents and after doing my field work in Cabo Verde in Brazil is people are protagonists of their own history. They wanted to be here and they wanted to be included in the agendas that shape the public policies. So thank you for attention.
Thanks so much. So we have about 10 minutes. So if panelists have questions for each other, or if there are questions from the audience from what has just been shared with you, if you had anything to offer in terms of what stood out to you, something that was shared by our panelists, or something that has not been said and is a burning question for you, anything that you would like to pose.
Hi, everybody. I have a question, a quick question. Is there and thanks to everyone also for their presentations and time. It's very interesting. Is there a physical copy of this, or is it only online?
Online. So we have an online version, yes.
Okay, very well. Thank you.
So we can share the link on the chat. so that you can have access to it. Hence, thanks for asking.
Thank you very much.
So maybe I will pose a question as people are thinking about the various papers. So as I was listening to all three papers, I was thinking of, Sarah, your comments about the senses and touch and sort of sensory pedagogy. Joanna talking about the classroom. And then Rachel, of course, talking about association. So in all three papers, what I saw is different kinds of pedagogical experiments. And I was thinking, as we think of pedagogy as a site of experimentation, whether it's a formal classroom or whether it's associations or building relationships with community, the very fact that we are thinking of pedagogy as a site of experimentation, I think immediately sort of shifts how we think of the instructor or a teacher in a classroom, the power dynamics, because it then also the instructor or sort of the community organizer also now inhabits a position of vulnerability because they are experimenting. So the experiment might work or might not. There are lessons to be learned from those involved in those conversations. So suddenly from an instructor, you're a co-learner as a co-creator and a co-thinker. So I'm just wondering if you can maybe elaborate a bit more from your, specific sites of experiences as to what does experimentation do in terms of, colonial modes of knowing and learning and what you're offering through your various kinds of sites. And anyone who wants to, respond, please.
I can maybe just share a few thoughts that sprung to mind right away. As you mentioned, challenging kind of hierarchies in the standard, teacher as educators, like lecturing, definitely working with Pipak and Hout. The day starts and ends in a circle. And so just being in that circle formation already feels radical. You're off-site, off campus, in community. There's a little hike involved to kind of get to the site, and everyone shares. And I think I wrote in the paper a bit about the humor as well. Like what bug would you be if you were a bug? Just kind of inviting that laughter and joy as well as being kind of part of that experimentation and connection. And then the other thing in terms of the senses, one that really resonates for me is sight, just seeing the old cement sort of smokestack. And then as we were picking out and cleaning up some of these sites, we were picking out like old toilets and old artifacts from the workers of the previous cement refinery. And it's just literally a kilometer away from Butchart. And so just that kind of jarring juxtaposition of this like beautiful manicured garden and then this small nonprofit trying to cultivate the land and revitalize it. So interesting kind of power dynamics there as well. And then I'll just quickly respond to Paul's comment here about kind of reaching out to a community in good faith. And one thing that's really great about this organization is that they are really excited about working with university classrooms. So they have kind of an established relationship with the university and they have like a standard fee. So one thing that ends up being required for us as teachers wanting to do that land-based learning is applying ahead of time for a grant to do experiential learning, and the university does have a grant. But one challenge arises is if you don't have your teaching allocation assignments yet and the grant deadline is due before. So I've definitely ran into that where I've sort of hypothetically applied for a grant and then luckily been allocated a certain course. But getting those timelines to match up can be a little bit tricky.
Maybe I'll just jump in and say, I think one of the things that we paid a lot of attention to at the front end of our summer school was kind of establishing collectively what the norms of interaction would be, and having the students say, this is how I'd like to be treated in the classroom. This is the kind of thing that really matters to me. So, giving people a chance to ask questions that may not be fully formulated and be okay with that, or to be, to show respect by letting people complete their thoughts, making sure that, people felt accepted, even if they had very different points of view, and how, and sort of how would you demonstrate that? So taking the time to establish those kinds of community guidelines was quite unusual for a lot of people. And, many who were in their doctoral programs had never experienced that. People that worked in community found it useful, sort of a useful tool that they would take into their own community engagement work. So it's just sort of the foundation of community and community engagement or community participation is like, what do you want? Like getting the community to define how it wants to work together. And the idea of sort of demonstrating that we were sharing power, that the instructors, the faculty coming in were going to tell you everything that you had to know, that there needed to be some self-direction, there needed to be some collaborative learning with teams. So we set up a lot of different teams that allowed people to connect with each other. And I think that, it wasn't perfect, I have to say, as someone that wanted, them to really dig into the literature. And then you had people coming from very different disciplines and experiences that, their take on a particular article might be quite different than my take. But, the fact that they were kind of trying to unpack it for the class was, I think, really helpful to them, even if it wasn't, I would say not always, hitting the mark, let's say, but they weren't there for the marks, in that sense. They weren't there for the grades. They were there for the experience and for the, their own, for learning for its own sake. So I think we tried to communicate that, and then to live it, and then to let things sometimes unravel in a less than perfect manner.
Yeah, and then learning not for grades, but for learning, that itself changes the whole, dynamic of colonial institutions, right? So that's amazing. Rachel, did you want to offer some thoughts?
Yes, and the group I studied in, learning happens through continuous educations and formative actions, not as a single interventions, but as a long-term political process. These spaces allow people to reveal themselves, their expectations, fears, memory, and also their conflicts, because we need to speak about the conflicts. And this is important even when conflicts appear. The group process becomes a place of collective discovery, where people learn to negotiate, deliberate, and eventually navigate in other spaces. So when you work with this community, you can gain knowledge and use it in different spaces like councils, local organizations, or even new associations then created themselves. So the emergent elements are for learning democratic pedagogics in this context is the protagonism, continuous learning, shared agents, group-based meaning making, and the productions of a new democratic practice from below. So I think it's the community has the power to understand the reality and tend this. But sometimes this not combined with the public policies, for example, or the concept of representative democracy. So behind the associations, we can use different theories like participatory theories and deliberative theories to understand this process, considers the territories, the Brazil and Cape Verde.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I think, you are bringing up, a different sort of angle where you are focusing on community-centered knowledge. So, right, so the community as shapers of their own destiny rather than, education happening, say, in the ivory towers, and then somehow we have to solve the problems of the community. Here is community, shaping their own destiny and being, active and agential, right, and engaged in shaping their social reality. So thank you so much for sharing that. So perhaps, I don't see any other questions on the chat. So maybe we will now turn to the final section, which is a panel discussion. To promote a larger conversation among our panelists and all of you who are gathered here with the aim of surfacing some of the questions and discussions, or sort of the key elements that are coming across in this collective work that we are doing together. And we have 3 questions for you, and we are going to ask these questions not as a way of trying to somehow define the field as sort of rigid definition of what democracy or democratic pedagogies mean, but to understand why this matters. Why does these conversations that we are having, these collaborations that we are trying to build, learn from each other, why are we engaged in this practice? What possibilities do they open for us? I know Joanna already gestured to tensions. Perhaps that's something to also talk about. What tensions do these kinds of conversations, whether we are working with community or in a classroom or associations, what kinds of tensions emerge? How do we resolve them? What kinds of tensions cannot be resolved? What are the challenges for practitioners and learners together as they are navigating this, new emergent, as Paul mentioned, this new emerging field? How do we navigate this space? And also a space that's uneven, right? So how, or hopefully the hope also is to illuminate the kinds of impacts and transformations, whether personal, institutional, political, that might emerge, or democratic pedagogies can generate. So this is going to be an open panel format. So we invite each of our contributors to speak to these 3 questions, drawing from their own sites of practice, reflection, and struggle to help us map where this work is headed and why it matters. Why are we in this conversation together? And we also invite reflection and questions from participants in this virtual room, as we open up the space for your collaboration and perspective. So we, of course, have a group of contributors, but we are hoping that you can join this conversation and help us to further our conversation, advance our thinking, and unlearning together. So audience members are welcome to pose questions to the panelists, to offer your observations based on your pedagogical goals and practices. So I would like to read the 3 questions, and please think of them as prompts or provocations for us to think together as a group. We will turn to the panelists first to start, helping us think through some of these questions, and then the audience will be asked to join in conversation. So the 3 questions are: what are emerging as the key elements or features of democratic pedagogies, and how are they different from or related to other pedagogies? Question number 2, why are democratic pedagogies important? And what opportunities as well as challenges are we seeing? And finally, what are the results, impacts, or kinds of change created through democratic pedagogies? So now I invite our panelists to respond to any or all of the 3 questions in whatever order you prefer. But the hope is that we can have a larger conversation beyond individual papers, but think of us collectively here as learners, co-learners, unlearning and learning in the process. So please, floor is yours.
Thanks, Chandrima. There are a lot of questions.
Yes.
Many questions. I'll just say, Rachel, if that's okay, I'll just start by saying, first of all, talking about democracy in the classroom is not usual. I mean, I think talking about democracy more broadly is also not usual. I think, again, maybe now, as we're seeing like this increased polarization, and people staying in their own kinds of bubbles and not interacting with people who have very different opinions from their own, creates a tension. But I think often we don't talk about democracy as a whole. We talk about human rights, we talk about justice, we talk about some of the features of democracy, but when we talk about democracy more broadly, I think we kind of lose people. And so when we talk about democracy in the classroom and democratic pedagogies, I think sometimes it just comes down to, I think, some very, very kind of fundamental practices that I think if we spent more time fostering these in the classroom, we would have by sheer the presence of these practices a greater democratic interaction. But I think we need to name them. It's things, like deliberation. Deliberation is around, figuring out what it is we've come to understand and how we've come to understand it. What evidence are we using to make particular claims? Putting our claims out transparently, against other claims, and sort of working through those. So doing that in a systematic way. Basic listening, listening to understand, even if it's something completely different. And that's where it does become very challenging. And Rachel, I know you talked about in community how, challenging that is. And when we talk about tensions in community, just learning to listen without trying to solve or to fix or to intervene, and just to say, this is what I've heard, can actually be, I think that is a radical democratic practice. Doing that intentionally in a classroom, I think really serves everyone extremely well. I think also, this idea of relationality, like we are all in relation to each other. Sarah talked about that, relate kinship. This is a very, I think, a deep Indigenous learning is that the sense of kinship that really we're only, I think, scratching the surface of in terms of Western thought, and especially in Western classrooms. This idea that we are in relationship sometimes is, I think if we paid more attention to relationships and care, the learning would be so much more profound. Thinking of those then within a context of democratic pedagogies, I think is maybe seems unusual to some people who are teaching, involved in teaching in higher ed where I work. That seems unusual, but you have people who are champions of this, like Genevieve Fuji-Johnson, who's political scientist, who said, I just stopped assigning so many papers and books to my students, and we focus on one or two readings. We focus on reading deeply and then talking about the meaning of these readings rather than, looking at, breadth and, just trying to get through the material. So those shifts, again, I think you could categorize them as democratic pedagogies. So I think we're just learning about what kind of fits into this basket called democratic pedagogies. And I think there's things that maybe some of us, if we're educators, we do these kind of intuitively, but I think it's really helpful to name them and to say, these are actually democratic practices too, listening, deliberation, dialogue. These are all like things that we need to be better at. And, I'll just leave it like that. So.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I just, found it interesting. But it's so profound. You said it's just basic listening, right? It's just basic listening and not listening to solve, right? But listening to care, listening to just not to be part of a solution, but to be in conversation in relation to, right? So that sounds profound, even if basic. Rachel, did you have thoughts?
And yes, not my only paper that I studied in non-formal educations, but I think we have interesting points with Joanna, for example, because the students or the member of community have in common the way they not passive recipient of knowledge. They want us to be listened, to be interpreted their own realities, and to be included. In case of the associations, that be included in policies agendas. And I think it's important created and co-created scenarios, or like Paulo Freire spread the dreams, and why it's important to think and rethink about democracy, because they created a political subjectives, not just informed citizens, for example. When people feel recognized and part of the something, they develop the confidence to move it into other space, to take the microphone, for example, in community, to propose policies, to mediate the conflict, or even to lead a new initiative. So break the way that we teaching or we learning. It's the way that we understand the democracies too. So this is important. It's not bell hooks and Paulo Freire, but we needed to consider the Almícar Cabral thoughts too, because they teach in Pan-African perspective how we can break the thoughts, the colonialism thoughts, consider the culture, consider different way to learn and teach. So I think it's important understand the gap between the academics and the community, and the knowledge, how is knowledge it's created in this way. So I thinking about the democracy pedagogy. It's a powerful possibility to change, because this pedagogy expanded the civic imaginations, created the new leaders, strengthened the local network, the stakeholders are more connected, and allow communities to be innovated their own methods and participatory approaches. So I think we need to combine and create bridges between academic approaches and saberes and knowledges of community. I think it's maybe it's the way to understand the democracy, because when I write my thesis, my dissertations, we use the Alex Tocqueville, we use democracy in American, we use a different literatures that not combined with nowadays. So we needed to create and engage new ways to discover and co-create or create what is democracy. And I think it's democracy draw about the education system and education's formal and non-formal system.
Yeah, Rachel, we in the Radical Democracy Summer School, we used a lot of case studies, and they were, I think, really powerful ways of showing the students the way that community, and mostly based in community action, farmers collectives and land back movements, health collectives, how a community in Greece was able to form a health collective through its collective agency. Other examples, this one from Australia that was really very creative, a group of grandmothers who were knitting sat in front of an oil and gas site that was being expanded, and they're in protest, in silent, sort of quiet protest, but they turned out in force, and they were very effective. And other examples where people tried to intervene in systems through collective agency and weren't always successful. For example, we heard from Astra Taylor, who is a filmmaker and also a sort of democracy theorist and practitioner. She worked on the student debt campaign in the States, and they worked extremely hard over several years, and were very close to an agreement with the Biden administration. And then that failed to go through. That they were trying to have student debt be forgiven. People were so burdened by their higher education debt that they were just struggling to survive, and it was across the country, but that was unfortunately not successful. And so she talked about the difficulty. I mean, you can encourage people to be sort of radically democratic, very civically engaged, but it is not a guarantee of any kind of successful outcome, except that it does create opportunities to build greater power, greater community. But hearing those stories of both successful system change and less successful, there are so many lessons, I think, in all hearing those stories, and unpacking the meaning of those stories in a way that helps people see what agency looks like, what power looks like, what system change could look like. And I just thought every day in our summer school we would do a checkout, and Sarah talked about the circle, like as an opening and a closing, and I think it is a really profound a way to collectively share learning. And one example from one of our early classes was, what were your takeaways from today? And it was one was how to do a better land acknowledgement, how to believe in hope, how to come to terms with coercion conflict, as part of radical democracy, the nuanced understanding of coercion, disempowerment. Hope should be co-constructed. They feel encouraged, how to respect all people, a distinction between being powerful and feeling powerful, and what are the standards of legitimacy. So from one day of learning, these are the kinds of things that students took away. And I think I find it so interesting. We can all be at the same webinar or in the same classroom, and we'll all take something different from it. And that's why, Paul, I'm glad you're encouraging people who are on this call to share, what is it you're hearing, but also what is it that you have tried yourself that is you would consider to be a democratic pedagogy. And maybe you don't even call it that, but maybe you're learning to see that within this broad kind of category. So it'd be great to hear from people. I saw somebody who had written about their deliberative donuts, and I was really interested in that. I think that's something to do with citizen assemblies, but love to learn more about that. Yeah,
Whoever that was, please share on the microphone.
Yeah. Sometimes a pause can be really helpful.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, what Joanna exactly said. So if you can please think of your own pedagogical practices, your own experiences in your classrooms, and maybe you want to share that with us so that we can democratize this space too. And it's not just the panelists and me speaking. So your own practices, your own experiences in a classroom, maybe what worked, didn't work, what lessons might it offer for us as we are, thinking of our own roles as educators. So please.
I'm sorry. I think I was just in the other room briefly. Somebody mentioned if I'm not mistaken, somebody mentioned the donuts.
Donuts, yes, please. We want to hear more.
Yes. So I haven't actually had the opportunity to try this in the classroom yet. But they're called donuts as as a nod to Kate Rayworth's donut economics, which some of you might be familiar with. And they're sort of a variation on that theme. Well, they're a reinterpretation of them for use as a classroom, as a rubric to evaluate classroom deliberation and anything really. I mean, they can be adapted. They can be populated with any criteria that one should want to evaluate for in the classroom. And so, yeah, that's essentially what I just wrote my thesis on, a place-based and sustainability education masters. And I don't know if I have the screen sharing capability, but if I do, I could just give a visual of that. Yeah, it looks like I do. So,
Are you able to share?
yes, I even have my defense presentation that I can just quickly run through. I think. Oh, okay. My screen sharing seems to not work, unfortunately.
So, Hans, you're talking about creative citizens assemblies. That's sort of the context.
Yes.
Where are you doing that work?
Well, that's a very good question because I'm currently based in Hawaii, but I'm moving back to Europe. So I'm going to be based in the UK for this. And that's where I'm going to be doing that, hoping
So
to.
do you see an application of a kind of a citizens assembly in the classroom? Do you think that, as a learning tool, have you experimented with that? Or I wonder if others on this call have done any work on citizen assembly type methodologies in a classroom setting, which I think would be really interesting.
Um, I have limited experience with that. I mean, I've researched it extensively, and not uh, facilitated classroom deliberation myself.
Somebody from UVic is saying they're hoping to experiment with this. Oh, what do we have here?
I was able to get the sharing started, but I feel like I'm taking up too much of people's time at this point. But if you are able to see this, this is a quick visual of such a rubric. This is my adaptation of the deliberative pedagogy learning outcomes rubric for
So
the classroom.
we are seeing your desktop, but not the file, I think.
Oh, okay. In that case, I can't. I'm
Maybe you
sorry.
could share a link to that in the
Yeah.
chat.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. My apologies.
No worries, no worries. Joanna, Rachel, and others in the room, maybe Bettina, Melissa, as well as others. Something that maybe we didn't talk about is joy, right? We talked about, things that can happen in the classroom, the tensions, but I'm wondering about, is there also joy? And is that maybe a possibility for hope, particularly given at a time of, what's happening in our world in a time of crisis and democratic backsliding all over the globe? What might the classrooms also offer as a site of joy? Could that also be, transgressive? So I wondered if, and not just the panelists, but others again who are teaching in different spaces, formal, informal spaces. Maybe you had thoughts. Please join the conversation.
Chandrima, can I jump in there?
Yes, please.
We've done a lot of work in our department, which is a global development department, on critical hope, right? As a pedagogy, this idea that how do you build a democratic practice around hope? And I know everybody's working on hope at the moment, but a hope that also, is quite aware of what the challenges are. Yeah. And so we're very interested in learning more about pedagogies for critical hope. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bettina, I know you've done a lot of work in the global classroom. So what have you discovered? Like, what is it that creates a sense of hope?
I think what we've discovered is, the importance of really working on understanding what the problems are, the problems around democracy and inequality, etc., as a foundation for building a pedagogy of hope, right? And that's so when students feel that the discourses and practices on hope are linked to deepening an understanding of what these complex problems are and what possible solutions might be, that the pedagogy becomes way stronger. Yeah. So, the students react to, when we talk about hope or joy, sort of disconnected from building the capacity to work on complex problems. The pedagogy is not as effective as if you really combine a pedagogy that really creates the capacity to visualize, understand, and address a problem with discourses of hope. Yeah.
Melissa, you're right. It's a bit of a cliche these days, Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Sure, Joanna. Yeah, I kind of was hesitant to put it in there because people use it all the time, but I think it really does capture some of what we need to be doing, right? And so on this question of hope, so again, I mean, I'm coming from the perspective of teaching in the university classroom, and you've spoken about this, Joanna, the question of grades and grading, and the extent to which the university classroom is designed as a kind of atomizing space, and a competitive and atomizing space, as opposed to, a kind of collective, collaborative space. So for me, part of a kind of pedagogy of hope is trying to think through the ways in which we can cultivate the collective in the classroom. That, because students are often dealing with and we're working through really difficult and sometimes quite horrifying histories of violence and subjugation. And, so in that context, how then do we produce the possibilities for their intervention, for their change? And so I found that when students work collaboratively, when they work together on projects, there is a kind of hopefulness that that the collective produces, and it's kind of the methodology of you're not alone in a way, right? You're not in this on your own. We all working together to produce thinking and ideas, and right. So yeah, so that's kind of one of the small approaches I think in my classrooms.
So, Melissa, does hope also come from the knowledge sharing of different histories? As you said, coming from difficult histories, so sort of also a knowledge about different histories and maybe how different communities, maybe in their small ways or big ways, how they might have been able to resist or show persistence, in the midst of the world crumbling. I mean, does that also maybe,
Yeah, for
produce hope?
sure. So the histories of resistances, but
Mm-hmm.
also I think that there's, in also dealing with those kinds of difficult histories, I think that they denaturalize them, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that kind of the kind of taken for granted normalization of hierarchies of race,
Mm-hmm.
gender, class, through the kinds of difficult histories. I think they offer a hope to the extent that, as we understand, as these things have been built, so they can be unmade,
Mm-hmm.
and as they've been built historically, so we can build. There's opportunities to build something else, right? So that's kind of also, kind of not taken for granted,
Mm-hmm.
history as this kind of natural process of,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah.
Yeah, and I think also in thinking of, as collaborators, thinking like, we have a say, perhaps we can do things differently. So, using imagination as, we are in this together and perhaps
Yep,
we can shape things differently for ourselves and our shared humanity. So, yeah,
absolutely.
I think we have a very quiet Zoom room here. So I'm wondering if we should just move to Bettina.
Yep. So I was asked to say something inspirational at the end. Yeah. So I am inspired, and I just want to pick up on three things that I've been thinking about as our presenters have been speaking. The one is inspired by Rachel, the importance of transferability. What are we learning from different sites? Rachel was speaking about community, everyday life, transferring that to the university. And we often talk about transferability, but I think there's a lot of very, very exciting work to be done to really develop that more, Rachel. And I was very inspired by your talk, Rachel, and taking lots of notes about what we can learn from associations and community-based experiences. Then the second thing was, I think it was Katie Reed who posted something in the chat about learning and listening to stories from youth and how youth speak about democracy. And what I found very inspirational today, I think all three speakers mentioned this, but we need to listen to the stories. Yeah. How are people speaking about democracy today? I think we make a lot of assumptions about how people are speaking, but there's a new, very inspirational opening, I think, and a new space for listening, as Joanna said, about how people are speaking and understanding democracy. And I think we don't know what that is. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of very interesting work to be done, opening up spaces for stories about democracy. And the third thing was Joanna's point about imagination as a democratic practice, I think is very exciting. Yeah. A lot of people talk about, what do we create, a creative pedagogy of imagination around democracy. And what does that mean? What do we mean by that? How do we understand imagination in different contexts, and across different parts of the world? What does imagination mean? And then how do we relate it to democracy? I think that is a very exciting field going forward. And then number 4 that I find quite inspirational is, and all three speakers spoke about it, but democratic practice as a collective practice, right? We do democracy and we do pedagogies of democracy collectively. But I think there's a lot of work to be done about how that actually works. Rachel, you spoke a bit about collective practices in associations and other community sites. But exactly collectively, what does the collective space offer to think about democracy differently in the current times? I think is a very exciting question. And linked to that, what collective actions emerge from collective spaces about rethinking democracy? So I'm very inspired by today, and I see a number of different avenues for more research and more working together. So thank you very much to all of you. I'm excited. Yeah. I think I'm handing over to Paul because Paul was going to close the session.
I think you said more than enough, Bettina. Thank you as always. I will just say, we recognize that it's an early December online session. We really appreciate you sticking with us right until the very end. I will just note as we close, I think we're also reminded that democratic pedagogies are not just methods or kind of one-off moments, right? They are deep commitments to learning and organizing that make more just futures and democratic futures possible. Across today's discussion, we've seen how these practices cultivate agency, reciprocity, and shared responsibility, even amid deep structural constraints and real tensions. People around the world are doing this work outside of this space, in communities, organizations, formal classrooms, and beyond. This is really just the beginning. And what emerges, I think, is collective refusal to give up on the transformative potential of education, and instead a willingness to lean into experimentation, creativity, relationality, inclusivity, and care. And so with that spirit, I think we look ahead with hope and determination. But also, we ask that you please, please, please join our newsletter. Maya's linking it in the chat. This will allow you to hear about our upcoming future call for papers for an edited book project on democratic pedagogies. We would love to hear more about your perspectives and experiences, as well as all the other events within the Participedia community. We really do extend an offer to get more involved in our community, including our upcoming Participedia schools. We look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a fantastic week and holiday, everyone. And we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.